Okay, Brian, I made you host.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, it's 6 o'clock. I think we probably give everybody another minute or two to kind of trickle in. But after that, we'll get started. Okay, so let's get started. My name again is Brian Isom. I'm the planning manager for the City of Inglewood Community Development Department. And today we have Mr. Chris Brewster, one of our consultants here to give you an update on where we stand with our update to our Unified Development Code. Chris, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Brian. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for tuning in again. Oops, excuse me. Sorry about that. This meeting will be another sort of status update. We've been working with the technical committee, so we'll give you some updates on that. And not a whole lot of new substance for this group. So let me try to share my screen here. Okay. Does everyone have the presentation title slide? Okay. Yeah, so tonight we'll cover mainly a little bit more background on the technical committee. We've been, when last time we met, we kind of gave you an overview of how we planned on engaging that group. And that's a group of mainly staff people that deal more directly with the code from different departments. So we're starting to branch out a little bit more into other areas, and also dig down a little deeper into the weeds on things that will work and not work and what we need to explore. So again, our overall schedule, we're still on track here as we hit the late summer months, preparing initial drafts that, and again, you all will be seeing those fairly shortly. And then we also have one of our council quarterly meeting updates coming up next week that I'll talk about a little bit here in the end as we wind up. As you recall, our overall big picture on engagement was to start with the listening sessions that you all were heavily involved in and primarily involved in at the end of last year. Our options exploration and some of the community outreach in the beginning of this year, February through April, and then now trying to figure out our route navigation and how we draft and update and piece back together the development code. So this is our schedule of engaging that staff group again on the more technical issues of what will work, what other concerns outside the development code do we need to be aware of, how will departments administer some of the new standards and new directions we're pushing on. And so those are kind of ongoing now under these four main themes. And so tonight's just we've had two of the meetings, and so tonight we'll provide an update on those. So if you remember when we last left off with this group, we had proposed a draft framework for how we're going to organize the code under these chapters, and they're not all that different from the current code, except for a few things we want to emphasize more that we're breaking out, and a few things that we're trying to de-emphasize that we're consolidating. But this is the overall organizational structure, and we'll have a document that clearly kind of walks you, when we have a full draft of sections, we'll have a document that clearly walks you through what's changing, why, what's not changing, why not, and those types of things. So we're beginning to marry the code over into this framework right now as we speak. So we have some what we're calling working drafts going on for those sections. So our first technical committee meeting was July 29th. And in that one, we dealt with the exciting subject of the technical provisions and procedures, application procedures. And that's how a person engages the code, or for those of you, of which many of you are planning commissioners, when you get involved, how and why, and those types of things. So we're trying to really just give clarity and greater expectations to the process, regrouping things into simplifying things where we can, not repeating things over and over and over again. So if there's common procedures, we want to have those all in one section. If there's application specific procedures, we want those broken out differently, so we only have to say them once. And then what we're trying to do is group each different application under four main things. What's the intent and applicability of that application, that particular application? So for example, a plat. When do I need to do it? Why do I do it? What's it for? Then the next section will be any application specific review procedures. So what of those general procedures apply to a plat, or what's different and unique only to plats, and that tells me what path and timing I'm going to go through. The third thing being the decision-making criteria. What's unique about this particular application? What can I expect to be reviewed according to, and how can I expect the decision to be made? And then the fourth, what's the effect of the decision? Do I have another step? Do I have an appeal if I don't like the decision? What happens because of the decision? So those four things you'll see repeated under all the applications, so that everyone has a really clear expectation, both citizens that might be impacted by an application, developers and landowners, obviously, but then you all as decision makers as well have a very clear path. And we've discussed with the staff that will also help us facilitate some of the reports and internal workings that they need to go through as well with applicants. So a summary of what that meeting talked about, some of the key items. The first one is doing a better job of outlining pre-application submittals versus formal submittals. And mainly staff's goal is to reduce the sort of multiple kind of free reviews that applicants are getting. So kind of to really cut that off and clarify the steps of what helps you prepare for your application, and you can't, overburden staff in that regard. When does the application be a formal submittal when we're going to run it through the process? So doing some things to clarify that, putting expiration dates on things that are sitting in there awaiting a response from the applicant or something from the applicant to do, so that they can mainly, instigate them taking the initiative to complete the application. But for others, maybe, it has gone dry and is no longer a valid application, and pulling the plug on that to where they would have to restart at some point. We talked quite a bit about which things need to be codified in the code versus which things can be operated by just internal department operating policies and procedures. A lot of times in procedures, we tend to try to put too much in the code, and then that can actually kind of bind us down and not help the all the players involved understand everything if we put too much in the code. So allowing some of that to be worked out internally between departments, and how you pass information internally, how you help applicants facilitate their application along without having specific code provisions. And so we're trying to do a lot of that, as long as we have the key points in there to where kind of key threshold points of each application. We can take some of the other things out and leave it to the departments. One of the items in there, the LUPs and CUPs, if you aren't aware, those are limited use permits and conditional use permits. So things that involve either a higher level of review to see if they're going to fit into their area, or things that are reserving discretion for whether you want to allow it or not, based on an application specific review. So the code accounts for both of those. One of the things it does, it's a bit unusual, at least from our outside perspective, is the requirement for annual reviews of all of those, and then reissuing the permit. According to staff, it's not too burdensome to do that, but it's a little bit of a unique process that we're exploring. Maybe don't do that. Maybe let them either be revoked if they're violated, but other than that, just let them kind of continue on unless the application came in and changed something, or unless conditions change. So we're exploring some ideas there along the lines of streamlining the code. Next one down, clarifying criteria. I kind of mentioned that as our overall goal. We talked a lot specifically about doing that in the parking, alternative parking plans. There's a lot of staff discussion on that being an example of something that maybe there's too many things in the code that don't really help, and it starts to create confusion on where staff's discretion is, where it isn't, and which things have become actually a burdensome process to get flexibility, when on the substance of parking, in which this committee's discussed, we know we want to have options to get to the right context. So that kind of reinforced a lot of the issues with regard to parking. So when we get to that section, which we talked about at our second steering committee meeting, we're talking about putting things in that would allow staff to grant flexibility to what's required based on some thresholds and criteria that are built into the code automatically, and it wouldn't trigger a plan review process, but then being very clear with things that go beyond that do take advantage of the current system that's in the code, those alternative parking plans. Notice and modernizing the requirements. A lot of the notice requirements are based on state statutes. So they're old to begin with, because they've been in your code for at least since 2004, probably, if not longer, because it's always been that way since you've been regulating development. And then the statutes obviously have been on the books even longer than that. So they're not as up to date on some of the modern communication tools, and we want to take advantage of that as much as we can, with the idea of being transparency and awareness of people impacted by applications. And so if we can do that effectively, more effectively than publishing something in the legal section of the paper, we're going to try to do that and make that the codified standard rather than something that's old and out of date. There was a lot of discussion, again, being the technical committee and people that deal with guiding the application from inception through to, constructed permits. How do we track any changes that have occurred past approval? So getting a little bit out of the development code realm and getting more into internal city communications and policies of getting from, planning approvals to permit. But it does tell us that we want to be very clear and aware that there are some level of changes that occur after the approvals due to taking the application to permitting, and being very clear on what the parameters of those are before, it would kick it back to having to go back to get it reapproved. So we're kind of tracking and monitoring that. And then the last one is talking about for larger applications, they're going to have infrastructure impacts. It's in the code now on what your required improvements are, and that, additional studies can be required to show that you're not having an impact, or showing, what is the extent of your impact on something like either transportation or water, being big ones, or sewer. It's in there now, but the committee was, honing in on it. Sometimes the applicants seem to be surprised by things like that, and we want to make sure we emphasize that and make that very clear that that's a goal of this development code. So again, that first meeting was a lot of dry things and a lot of procedural items, but that's the summary of what we've covered. We do have a working draft of these sections going right now that's under internal review at the planning group, but that will be one of the first things that you guys see once we address some of these topics that the committee discussed. So I'll pause there to see if I triggered any questions or any thoughts that are on people's mind about the current code and where we're going with that in terms of procedures.
I just have a quick question and this is probably old school, but it's the way I think. Are you gonna have like flow charts so people can just visually see what they have to do, or some sort of I know that it takes up space and then has to be updated, and not everybody likes flow charts, but it can provide clarity.
Yes. One of the things that I tend to think in terms of tables a lot of times. So one of the things we definitely going to do, and you have a table in there now, it's just really big and cumbersome. So we want to at least start there and clear that up and make sure that's showing someone the exact steps of an application and what they need to do. A lot of times when we have done them with flow charts, and we will if they work with this code as well, because even though they take up space, if they can take up, even if they take up a whole page, but help someone filter through and better understand 4 pages of text, it's worth it to use it for that space. So we'll look at that. What we find though, a lot of times is the flow charts don't make a lot of clear distinctions, because it's application, review, decision, appeal, or if there's another step in there that's council, it's that. So there's not that many variations among the different applications. But if we see a need to do that, we certainly will, and our radar is kind of up to your issuing point. Bottom line is we'll do anything that makes it pretty clear, but a lot of times a general flow chart for applications can work to help with that. I'm kind of backpedaling a little bit, because when I think of where it does get complicated and can really help is on the timing of things. So, notice often has to be a certain amount of days before your official planning commission meeting. Okay, so let's back that out. And how do I create a timeline for the project? If I had to have a neighborhood meeting, where would that fit in, and where am I going to know about when I would need to do that? So there are things like that that we'll try to more graphically show as well.
And
then,
can I chime in quick, Judy?
Oh yeah, sorry.
On that, our intent as staff is to kind of work with our communications department to create, once we get the code adopted, is to kind of create some one-pagers that make things a little bit easier for folks to navigate. The person that's trying to build a fence in their backyard doesn't need to be an expert on our code, just needs that one little piece. But yeah, that's something that we could probably look at as well. Both cities that I worked in prior to this had development handbooks that they weren't adopted through council. They just were kind of very thin books that really talked about, if you're doing X, then you need to do, Y, Z, A, B,
Oh,
things like
perfect.
that. So
That's sort of what I think I was more thinking of in the procedure side of things.
Sure.
And then real quick on the limited use and conditional use stuff. So I actually had experience with when I have a client who, I'm a real estate broker, had a client who actually owns a property here he sold it, property here in Englewood that has a conditional use of having a barber shop on it. It's been there forever, right? And so he did sell it to a barber, so a house and the barber shop attached. And that's an annual kind of thing. If where can someone like me find that there's a conditional use? Because if you're not being reminded every year that you have to say something, and that could get lost, I guess. And people don't save things, they don't keep track of things. So if we're not going to do some sort of regular, hey, are you still doing this? Where would I, as somebody trying to help, somebody trying to sell, say, well, I think there might be, I think one time you were allowed to use this for XYZ. Where would I even find that out? Is it just call somebody and you look up the address, or is there some way? I don't know. People don't save things. So if they have a limited use, I have another client who lives, and I know we're getting rid of the first floor 50%, but every year they had to sign their little letter that said that they were still using it as a residence and 50% of the first floor was not commercial. But it also prevented them from being able to sell it to somebody who wanted to scrape the house. So, we at least had that document, that letter saying this is what the problem is, and because that's a disclosure issue. So I know that's a me problem, but I think I'm not going to be the only one with people who have those. So.
Yeah, I'll answer from the code standpoint of what we're used to seeing. That doesn't mean that's the way you all have to address it, and then let Brian or other staff chime in on the internal practices because ultimately what you're getting at is it's a record keeping item. So the way we usually treat it with there's two kind of things that have a similar problem to what you're mentioning. The first one being a non-conforming use. And I know what you're referring to is different than that because it received a specific approval, but they have similar issues of record keeping. What we are used to on non-conforming uses is those are on the burden of the applicant to come in and prove that they were legal at one point in time. And even though they're not meeting the code right now, they have a right to continue doing that. And we're aware of a couple of issues or problems. Well, at our last meeting, we had a person participate that had that situation. And so what we're used to is that's on the applicant to come in and prove that they hit that requirement. And then if they do, then all of the eligible provisions of the code apply of, how lenient or how strict are you on, can they change or expand? What do they do with that? Now, in a lot of cities, then once the applicant does that and goes to the work to prove that, they might want a certificate of validity to say, yes, I did that and I want something. And then they could record that with the property so that anyone searching the property could find it. But that's usually one that's on the applicant. The flip side is that the limited use permits or conditional use permits that you're referring to, usually there is a codified process that would say, okay, once approved, and one of the things we're exploring is once approved, do you really have to renew it annually? Or can it just continue to exist as long as it's in existence and nothing changes? So there's a kind of information record keeping aspect to that. But what we're most used to is the latter, that you don't have to annually renew it because a lot of times some of these also have financing issues attached to them. That if you have to annually review it, it means maybe you don't get approved the next year. And so that's kind of a concern. So there's issues that we're sensitive to there, but an easy thing to do is just to say, well, once they're approved, they should be recorded. and the applicant needs to record them, then everyone tracking it can find that. So that's something we could build into the code. I think that the bigger question that the technical committee will have to come back with a recommendation on is, do we want to keep it as an annual renewal? And then the other part of your question is, if not recorded, is there an internal staff record keeping, which with the annual approvals, I'm sure there is. I just don't want to answer for Brian or John, or if Brooke's on the call. But I would assume that the staff is tracking it by property address somehow, that you could call and find that information. I just don't know how easy or difficult it would be.
So on the non-conformities, we do keep records. You know, we have an annual registration, and I think we're getting ready to send out the registration forms for this year. And we use our IMS system to track it, I believe, by property address. So we do have that. As far as the, you know, the conditional use or limited use, in the cities that I've been in, the limited uses are generally not tracked that way, but conditional or special uses are usually tracked through their zoning map. You know, that's not something that we've really talked about up to this point, but, you know, if that's a direction that the committee chooses to go and the council chooses to go, you know, that's something that we'll certainly kind of take a look at.
Any other questions on procedures or technical issues?
And
All right. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
Chris, before you go, we have somebody on here that I did not recognize their name or their phone number. I've got a 303-355-5319. I just want to make sure that it's not a citizen wanting to make any comments before we go forward. Okay, go ahead, Chris.
All right. So our second meeting was last week, or I guess a week ago Friday. We began talking primarily about street design, but it's streets and public realm issues dealing with the development code. And mainly that's going to touch on chapter 3, where we're repackaging some of the subdivision standards into broader community design standards. So streets, open spaces, lot patterns, things that are bigger picture if you were platting a larger scale development, is where we plan on housing some of those, because it's a coordinating element, that things that impact multiple properties on a block or even several blocks. And then also access and parking, obviously driveways, frontages, thinking of parking, whether it's vehicle, bicycle, transit access as part of your transportation system, that kind of end of the line. How do sites accommodate that end of the trip, so to speak? And how does it relate to the street design? And then also touched on some of the landscape standards, because we do want to really coordinate streetscape, frontages, and that type of landscaping design, especially associated around parking as well, to integrate these things into the community. So that big picture design of spaces between buildings, so to speak. So those topics were addressed by the committee a week ago Friday. And these were some of the key observations. Obviously, we've done the math, and we did some of it with this group in our detailed discussions at the end of last year on right-of-way widths, street widths, and street design, and how do things work out. And obviously there's not going to be enough space for the ideal in every case. In some cases there will, in some cases there will be more than enough. But we know we're going to have to make some choices, and we know we're going to want those choices to be context based. So getting those standards keyed towards particularly the sidewalks and landscape amenities. We talked quite a bit about attached sidewalks versus detached sidewalks and which direction we're going, but mainly coordinating that with some of the transportation elements of the street. Right now, if there's not enough space, staff is getting those things through transportation easements. So if the curb width is taking up, curb to curb's taking up too much of the right of way, there's not enough left for the ideal landscape area or sidewalk. As development occurs, they're asking for transportation easements to get a little additional width for those things. We also we're looking at maybe making some trade-offs for, that's we're plan on starting with the ideal street cross section. And when we run into situations where there's not enough room, maybe it is a trade-off between different priorities for that context. Bicycles lanes versus on-street parking is a frequent one that you'll see. And those spaces actually are quite comparable. So that's a nice benefit to the street sections. So in a lot of the sections, we're already planning for a contingency of on bike routes, eliminate the one side of the parking, and then all of a sudden now you have room for a protected lane or something like that. So those are the two options we want to build into, again, starting with the ideal and then having contingencies for how do we get additional space or how do we change priorities within the ideals if we need to. That kind of leads to the second big point, which was having some really practical guidance and general rules for how we make those decisions. So on the landscape amenity, it's really relative to that attached sidewalk versus not attached sidewalk. Where do you put the landscape? We talked a bit of like the best rule is it should be keyed towards, do you have a bunch of on-street parking or not? If you do, a lot of times you do want the sidewalk to be attached, and the landscape is either integrated into that in tree wells or planter boxes, or it's to the outside of that area because people getting in and out of cars get right onto the sidewalk in that case. And then the opposite, if it's on a traffic moving street where there's the edge is either a bike lane or not on-street parking, then you want that landscape amenity separating the sidewalk from the moving vehicles. So similar rules kind of track down through all of them. The bike facility one, as this group talked about, it's really relative to the speed differentials and what's a safe, comfortable speed or volume. And that's going to determine whether you have a shared facility at the very lower speeds, a dedicated facility at moderate speeds, and a protected or off-street facility ideal at the higher speeds. And I have a typo in here. I see land width, that's supposed to be lane width, but that's the one that drives it all, no pun intended. When we talk about our vehicle space, that's the one that we want to look at most closely and be making sure that we're aligning that to our desired speeds and volumes to begin with. And if we're not, that's where we can kind of gain some of this extra space that's needed. So ultimately, though, I think what the committee landed on is with a built out city, established right away and road widths, but wanting to change things as development occurs, we need two things. We need interim strategies, things that can get us part of the way there as development occurs. And we need flexibility to, if not having the ideal specification built into the code, at least having the right decision-making criteria that help us balance some of these competing interests is where the committee was landing on as the best approach. And I think that's fairly consistent with what this group wrestled with as well. I might pause there before I move on to the other non-street ones, because I know that might stimulate a lot of thoughts or questions or discussions because it's a big one.
Chris, I don't know if this is the appropriate time for it, but one thing that keeps sticking in my head is when we're looking at a PUD that's in a industrial area and they come in, well, we're going to do a mixed use or a residential, but we're going to do better than the industrial for landscaping, but not as much as what would be required in a normal. Is there something that we can, is that something that could be covered in here to kind of say that if you're going to put in a development with, a residential use, then you have to meet the residential, even if you're doing a PUD or some sort of other land use?
Yes, no, that's a good point. And that example was even brought up. I think it's fresh on staff's mind because that example was brought up in our technical committee. And that's where the idea of sidewalk width relative to density came from, that we want a standard that's based on, at this threshold, the 5-foot sidewalk's not good enough. And then we also talked, I hesitate a little bit on the landscape and streetscape element of it, because a lot of times that might be based on, where the curbs are. Curbs are kind of expensive to move. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to be open to really creative strategies of where, bulb outs or things. We talked about areas where you can concentrate landscape and have an even larger impact, because so think of a full block development And if the curb is set and it's too expensive to move the curb to get a really nice tree-lined streetscape, well, doing a mid-block bulb out and a bulb out at two ends with a really large concentration of landscape amenities might have the same effect as it had we done it the other way. So at least having those options as, almost like a good, better, best type of standard that lets you solve the problem and meet the intent and goal in a practical way, I think is where we're headed. But I don't know if that answers your question or raises more questions.
And really, I guess it is a question of whether that should be in this part of it, or if it should be in the PUD side. To reference back to here, I guess it was really more of a question for me. I think what your thoughts are great on it, though, and that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think where we landed on that was we may not have the exact right solution in here, but we want to put a target in there and then put the decision-making criteria that lets us get to the right solution for that particular project, whether it's a PUD or not, I think is where we're going. Brian, you might want to elaborate. I know
Sure.
you guys had some thoughts on the PUDs as well.
And I think, Colin, part of this is more of a policy thing that staff does. In that when someone presents a PUD, they generally are presenting it against the base zoning district, which may be industrial, but also from a staff's perspective, having them show what the use would be comparable to one of our other residential districts. I mean, if it's not something that we codify through this process, that's something that we could, start having them do that comparison for us throughout the PUD process, rather than making it a codified decision. It's more of a policy thing that we would do.
Yeah, and I could see, I guess maybe we don't get all the way, like you're saying, and what we really want to do is allow you as a staff to be able to make the right decision for the specific project, but have those guidelines or the goals for that, I think would be good to show in there. So I hear where you're coming from, Brian.
Okay. Yeah, Christine.
I was going to say this, but I would also love if PUD process could include a way to consider bike lanes for that whole block, even though that one project might only be a small portion of that block.
Yeah, and we talked quite a bit about that part of it. And I think we're going to, where I think we will probably end up on the bike facilities is having the default prioritizing those, particularly on certain orders of streets. But then also being very careful to kind of tie to the walk and wheel master plan. And I think John might be on this call because he seemed to have the best insights into how to handle that. But again, that master plan is giving guidance without having the exact technical standard of the bike widths. But we also talked a lot about, the NACTO guide on how wide certain facilities should or shouldn't be is a really, really good resource. And if not marrying some of those things over into the code explicitly to give us at least the range of types of bike facilities that we want, at least referencing that as a guide to help us make those decisions when we encounter them. But I think your overall point, we would all agree with it. It only makes sense to do that on at least a full block length, and then ideally, the bigger system, it's got to be an increment of something that keeps going, I think will be important. Incidentally, one of the things in the working draft that we've been looking at as well is there are some current provisions on bike access to as a site design element, not as a bigger street design element. And we're trying to marry those as well into the code. So there's things that talk about when you have on-site bike parking, having bike access to the nearest bike facility, things that are a little bit vague. That's like, yeah, I know what they're getting at, but what we want to change it to what we're really saying is this: if you're providing access to your site and it's walkable and it's a distance where people could reasonably get off the bike and walk to the bike parking, great. If there's areas where you're planning on pedaling in just like a car would pedal in, we're going to want that car access to be balanced with a bike lane and bike facilities that makes it safe and accessible, just like we would on a street, and then figuring out the in-between ground on some of those things as well.
That makes sense, and that sounds good. It seems like the disconnect is that the walk and wheel plan was somewhat based on demand. And they didn't look at where huge apartment buildings would be going in because we don't know, can't predict the future there. So I don't think those did build in bike lanes on streets where apartments will go in the future. And then once they're in, then parking goes in next to them, and then you say you can't add a bike lane because then you'd have to take away parking.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, I understand the tension there. Yeah. Well, we'll take a closer look at it. I think, in my opinion, I think my assumption was now on all situations, we won't probably, that parking versus bike decision is, we've run into it in just about every city we encounter. It's a key tension point on all street designs, and it's I think there's a solution to it in most cases, because I think we can be, it's easier to be creative with parking, let's put it that way, than it is with the bike facilities, because that's part of transportation and getting somewhere. Whereas the parking, what this committee's discussed, that's something we want to reduce as much as we can. We want to be as flexible with it as much as we can. So I think there's some win-wins that we can look for in the code. There's also some, a lot of these things we're talking about are things that are built that last a lot longer than their actual design might. So as long as we're building things that are easily convertible between different uses, I think that's a good option as well to be aware of. So that's what I was kind of referring to earlier when I said that the convenient part is when you look at how much space we're allocating for parking versus bike, it's almost the same. And a bucket of paint can change it in an evening. So any other street design issues? Okay, moving down to the rest of the topics. We haven't touched much with this committee on open space design, other than from its sustainability and the landscape amenity part of it. But there is something in the development code now regarding open space dedication and fees in lieu of that space. And our question to staff was, is that still functional and usable as a built out city? And the answer was yes, it is. So we aren't going to really mess with that, other than we talked a bit about the fees and it may need to be revisited. I think there's some projects going on that are looking at that now that we're going to want to coordinate with. But that would probably be one of those items where in our bigger scheme of things that we bring it up, as I think some people in this group have said, we want to capture some of these next steps or things not to forget about. And so that would be one of those, but we do want to build that, keep that in as intact as possible. But that spun us off on a different discussion on less on the public spaces and obviously it's smaller scale development now, dealing mainly infill and redevelopment. You're not getting big dedications of spaces. Most projects are using the fee provision rather than dedicating open space, because they just don't have the types of spaces that the city is looking for in a project. So that spun us off in the idea of supplemental open space. We know sites still need more open space and they're able to provide oftentimes through dedication. So how do we deal with that? And having the code really right now doesn't have clear standards for things like a courtyard or a plaza or some of those smaller, more urban spaces that we're going to want to build in to help support development. And it really, when you think about it, all of the residential projects we've been talking about had a lot coverage standard. And so what we're talking about is the reverse of that. What are we doing with the mirror image of that space? We want to make sure it's not just a number. In other words, if you have 30%, you're good. Maybe 20% of a well-designed plaza makes it good. And so we want to look at that and key them more towards the building types as well. By building type or by density is one of the things we talked about with the group. There was some discussion on the alleys as well as we got into parking and access. And the idea of exploring potentially a green alley solution. The direction from Public Works was they've looked at that, and there's not a big stormwater benefit to it, although they're not foreclosing ever doing that. Right now, their direction is the standard for improving the alley is going to be a concrete standard. And we may look at the width and the section of that and what you do within the alley right-of-way space and giving some options to that. But as far as any kind of more innovative design or construction technique, the tendency was to say no, mainly because their studies they've done didn't have that as the stormwater solution for the city. So there wasn't a lot of, they're quite costly, and they're also difficult to maintain. So any of those that would be done, they would want to shift to private maintenance. So the direction was more to keep that to a basic standard and looking for other ways to build in the green parts of the system. But certainly maintaining them for all the important things they do for access and street design, and emphasizing that when you have alley access, that's how you should access your site rather than the curb cuts. So there's a lot of current things in the code regarding that, and we'll look at particularly on the residential side as we get to smaller and smaller lots. There's a direct correlation to the smaller you get, the more you should have to be accessed by the alley rather than not, because of the compounding effect of driveways on streetscapes and things like that. Lastly, on parking, a good kind of introductory discussion to all the things we've talked about as far as context, getting the right amount of parking, but also not pushing too far in a direction the city's not ready for. We know that, we've heard acceptance of some of these other housing types in neighborhoods as long as the parking problem is solved. So we know there's a sensitivity to not going too far, at least in the community, but at least all the things we talked about with staff seemed reasonable of building in. This goes back to the original comment I made of building in as many things as default or administrative as we can to help get to that right number. And the idea of the soft maximums, if you're providing way more parking, we're going to want some additional mitigating things, whether that be landscape, shared parking, alternative transportation elements, whatever, things that balance that car versus transit bike people space element. And then the last item was the electric vehicle parking discussion. One of the staff members or technical committee members had an update that the action plan is in process, and that might correspond nicely to the winding up of this project, where we can take directly from that EV action plan that people are working on separately and incorporate those findings directly into the parking section of this code. And we'll probably talk more about that in our last technical committee meeting. We're going to take on the sustainability issue and probably circle back on that. So we might have an update for you next time as well on that. So any other thoughts or discussions on this part of it?
Before we jump in, we've got about 10 minutes left in this meeting before we've got to shut it down and go to our Planning and Zoning Commission.
All right, seeing no questions, that's a good segue for me to get ready to give you all a 10-minute break before your next meeting. Just to wind up, we are next week giving a quarterly update to the City Council, which will be this plus probably our last 2 or 3 meetings with this group, because we haven't met with the council since shortly after the public engagement sessions. So giving them an update on the draft framework and some of the additional direction you all gave us as an outcome of the public engagement. And then the rest of this slide is things we saw last week, kind of preparing you for what the next few months are going to be as we start to roll out the drafts of these chapters. We would expect to be ready with some of the first provisions, many of the things we covered tonight for you in a draft format at that September meeting. And then hopefully following along with the other really substantive ones at an October meeting, and then leaving the ones that that are more fill in the gaps. We don't see a lot of substantive policy changes or real exciting changes, but we just want to build them into the code, having those at a third follow-up meeting of the draft. So that's how we plan on grouping them. And then as we mentioned, that we're going to give this to you probably in at least 2 formats to not overwhelm you. For those of you that want to read the whole draft sections of the code, you can. For those that don't want to have the highlights, we'll have some type of guide to help you navigate through. This is an image of it, what we did with another community, a section map where we showed, here's the existing code section, here's where you find it in the new code, and here's some blurbs about what's changing and why. So we'll have something like that to help you as well. And again, trying to get that to you as far in advance as possible, hopefully on the outside of 2 weeks in advance of the meetings. So with that, that was all I had. If there's no other discussion, I give you a quick break before your next meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for your time.